Hello and welcome to my channel NB Soundhopper UK, and the subject of this video will be 10 albums from the 1980s which I consider to be under the radar. What do I mean by under the radar? Broadly, something that's gone unnoticed or undetected. Strictly speaking though, the albums I'll be talking about weren't undetected because I and a few thousand others, possibly, bought them. Nowhere near enough to bring them close to the mainstream at the time though. What I don't see under the radar as meaning is underrated. It's a term that I dislike anyway. It's overused, and very often I feel that the people using it are venting a misplaced sense of injustice because not everybody likes what they like. I digress. Several of these albums were released by Illuminated Records, an independent label that ran between 1980 and 1987, but attracted nothing like the attention of other independent labels like Two Tone, Mute, or Factory. Illuminator's main but not exclusive focus seemed to be on subgenres that emerged after post-punk and a direction that was looking towards the late 1980s and early 1990s. This is not a ranking video, by the way, and I'll present the albums in no particular order. But enough preamble, let's crack on. First up is Urban Gamelan by 23 Skidoo. It's their third album, released in 1984. It followed on from their debut 7 songs, which had an industrial funk and krautrock crossover feel to it, and then the Culling is Coming, a much harsher affair, and veering more towards gamelan, an Indonesian style predominantly using assorted types of tuned and metal percussion, and music concrete, a technique often using found sounds manipulated into tape loops, a kind of sound collage. With Urban Gamelan released on Illuminated Records, gamelan and music concrete elements remain, but there are reggae and dub parts and African sounds too. With the inclusion of ex-Lynx bassist Sketch, funk is brought back in, and the excellent loping bass line to the opening track FUGI highlights his abilities. The track title refers to a sample from Apocalypse Now used in the track. Fire gets into the reggae dub territory, and the remainder of side 1 brings together many of the elements I've mentioned. Side 2 is a 7-part interlinked, mostly gamelan piece, in some parts frenetic, in others hypnotic. It's a fine absorbing effort. Next is Camouflage Heart by Cindy Talk. This album, also from 1984, has a very oppressive mood throughout. If I had to categorise it, I'd say it was somewhere between dark wave and industrial. Although the mood is consistent, it doesn't really have a signature sound in terms of instrumentation. Some tracks have a heavily fuzz bass guitar in the foreground, a sound that almost anticipates the guitar sounds used by the likes of Godflesh and Sun O years later. Other tracks have a scratchy, jagged guitar as their focus, and others utilise low-frequency electronic pulses with minimal accompaniment. It's an intense listen, with Gordon Sharp's singing giving it emphasis. At times it's as though he were purging the darkest depths of his psyche. Next on the list is Fiction Tales by Modern Eon, their one and only album released in 1981. I bought it after seeing them supporting the Stranglers on their Men in Black tour. This is what I consider to be classic post-punk in a similar vein to the Concert Angels, Joy Division, The Sound, and early Cure. The inclusion of sax gives Modern Eon a warmer feel though, and there's a greater sense of positivity than any of the bands I've compared their sound to. The central lyrical theme is the use of imagination, or the ability to turn dreams into reality, whether that be via cinema, literature, or dance. Tracks like Second Still, Playwright, High Noon, Choreography, and Waiting for the Cavalry are obvious examples. Sadly, in 1981, post-punk had become an extremely crowded marketplace, and Modern Eon would release no more as a unit. However, if most bands have one great album in them, Modern Eon were lucky enough to get it right first time. The fourth selection is A New Form of Beauty by Virgin Prunes. This album is actually a compilation of A New Form of Beauty parts 1 to 3, released as separate singles in 1981, and the cassette A New Form of Beauty part 4, released in 1982. Virgin Prunes were at the avant-garde end of post-rock and goth. If anything, they were as much an art project as they were a rock band. They came from Dublin. In fact, their guitarist Dick Evans is the brother of The Edge from U2. Transgression against the Catholic orthodoxy in the Republic of Ireland was a theme in much of their material, and the outrageous live performances they gained a reputation for. Sandpaper Lullaby, Beast, and No Birds to Fly are tracks that illustrate the great contrast in the Virgin Prunes sonic palette. By no means an easy listen, but well worth the effort. Next up is Eligible Bachelors by the Monochrome Set. When it came out in 1982, the sort of jangly new wave played by the Monochrome Set wasn't exactly flavour of the month. Yet within a year, things would change and bands like the Smiths became popular. So why this album didn't then gain a little attention after the fact would seem, on the surface, a bit of a mystery. It has tunes which rival anything on the Smiths' debut, and the lyrics are probably even wittier than what Morrissey was writing at the time. What has to be taken into consideration is the state of music journalism in the UK in 1982, when a backlash against all things London was very much in place. Guess where the Monochrome Set came from? Yep, London. If they'd been from Manchester, I suspect this album would have ended up a lot better known. The Jet Set Junta, The Mating Game, Fun for All the Family, and The Ruling Class are all songs which deserved a wider audience and still do. The next album is Return of Quebec by Dormanu, another album on Illuminated Records. This one is from 1985 and was the sole release by Dormanu. It mixes synth pop complete with extensive use of Lindrums, a fair amount of slap bass, and a guitar sound that flits between an industrial buzz and something Nile Rodgers-esque. So some disparate elements there. However, they all come together well in a selection of mostly pop-rock songs. There's nothing particularly challenging about this album. It does move towards goth in places, but soon eases back into lighter shades, including the almost Bo Diddley sounding track Tragic Fascination. Alas, this album has never been released on CD, a format which would allow for the inclusion of their 3 singles as well. Hopefully, a label such as Cherry Red might acquire the rights to release it one day. Seventh on the list is the curiously titled If I Kissed Her, I'd Have to Kill Her First by 400 Blows. There's quite a mixed and strange collection of tracks on this 1984 release, also on Illuminated Records. You've got mutated funk or electro on Groove Jumping, Declaration of Intent and Conscience, ambient on Lapwing Chant and Men of the Divine Wing, an odd mix of bluegrass with a drum rhythm not unlike that of Iggy Pop's Lust for Life on Them Thar Hills, the industrial sounding Love, and then the album's longest track entitled For Jackie M, which consists of a 6-minute plus interview with Charles Manson. Funnily enough, despite this variation, it makes for an interesting listen. Another album which has never made it to being released on CD, more's the pity. Next is Murmur by Hula. Of the trio of Sheffield-based post-punk stroke industrial bands, Cabaret Voltaire, Clock DVA and Hula, Hula probably got the least amount of critical attention. Funk was a lot more prominent in their writing, and if anything, they were a bit closer in sound to A Certain Ratio than their Sheffield contemporaries. They released 5 albums between 1983 and 1987, and I could have picked any one of them for this video, but I've gone with Murmur from 1984. The music and lyrics exude a sense of paranoia. The vocals are recorded with a fair amount of reverb and echo, and often become chants. The slap bass lines are economical but punchy. It almost gives the track Tear Up a kind of seasick feel. Guitars are brittle and sharp and in places become dissonant noise. Beats range from hypnotic to tribal. Synths and samples provide added texture. What's not to love about all that? The ninth selection is The Empty Quarter by The Youth and Ben Watkins. Who are these people? The Youth, or more simply Youth, real name Martin Glover, was the original bass player with Killing Joke. Ben Watkins was the singer for a band called The Hitmen and then founded the 90s trance band Juno Reactor. On this album, though, there are no vocals, and it's a soundtrack to the play Street Captives by Jonathan Moore. The play is about urban alienation in the early 1980s. I've never seen it, so I can't make the connection between its subject and the album artwork, which looks like it's inspired by Mayan or Aztec architecture. The music aims for the kind of audience that might have liked My Life in the Bush of Ghosts by Brian Eno and David Byrne, or Thief by Tangerine Dream, and it's a decent effort. Released in 1984 on Illuminated Records, it's another which hasn't been released on CD. Surprising, as it's an album which I feel enhances the reputation of the performers rather than the opposite. Finally, for both this list and Illuminated Records, it's Step Forward by Portion Control. This band's forte was industrial electronic music. When this album was released, they started to move towards a slightly more melodic sound and mix this with a few ambient textures. The melodic tracks are a sort of unpolished version of the Pet Shop Boys, but the vocal style was way too abrasive to make Portion Control chart material. Nevertheless, this is probably the pick of their albums released in the 1980s. Whilst it is available on CD, you'd have to buy Archive, their 4 CD collection of 80s material, which is now anything but cheap. So listening to the album on Spotify is probably your best bet. So that's it, 10 under the radar albums from the 1980s. There will probably be a second video on this subject at some point. The usual request at this stage, though, if you could give the video a thumbs up or thumbs down, that would be greatly appreciated. Any comments, positive or negative, would also be useful to me too. Even more useful would be any comments relating to the names of bands that you feel might have gone under the radar in the 1980s, and if I've not heard of them, I will check them out. In the meantime, though, thank you for watching.